Welcome to the Hospital Finance Podcast, your go-to source for information and insights that can help you stay ahead of the challenges impacting healthcare finance. And now, the host of the Hospital Finance Podcast, Michael Passanante.
Hi, this is Mike Passanante, and welcome back to the award-winning Hospital Finance Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about Transfer DRG revenue recovery, which, as I'm sure many of you know, is something that we specialize in at BESLER. And in particular, we're going to be focusing on the importance of clinical reviews. You know, a lot of hospitals have their own in-house recovery processes, or they contract with one or more vendors to recover Transfer DRG revenue. But of course, no two processes are the same. And at BESLER, we really focus on compliance and on clinical reviews. And we're going to get into why we do that. And to help me understand why we do that and share and lend her expertise to all of us in the audience, I'm joined by Mary Devine, who is the Director of Revenue Cycle Services here at BESLER. Mary, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Mike. Happy to be back.
So, Mary, for those in our audience who may not be familiar with Transfer DRGs, could you give us a brief synopsis of the post-acute transfer rule?
Sure. So the post-acute transfer rule was put in place in the 90s while providers were focused on shortening the length of stay. You know, you get the DRG and regardless of the length of stay, so providers were really focused on getting the patients out the door faster. And what was happening is there were certain scenarios and certain cases where the patients were being discharged way below the geometric mean length of stay, and then the patient was going off to receive some sort of post-acute care, whether it be SNF or home care or what have you. And then, so Medicare said, well, you know, I'm paying for the rehab on the knee replacement for the 3 days they should have been in the hospital, and I'm paying for additional rehab again once they transfer to either the skilled nursing or the inpatient rehab. So Medicare said, you know what, I don't want to pay for the care twice. So for these certain DRGs, if the patient is discharged below the geometric mean length of stay and the discharge status code indicates post-acute care, the provider is going to receive a per diem payment. And so that was originally at 10 DRGs when it first came out, and now it's at 280 DRGs. So it has significantly expanded over the lifetime of the transfer rule.
And Mary, you just mentioned the post-discharge status code. Why is that so important as it relates to the rule?
So what the discharge status code indicates, that indicates the care that the patient is receiving post-discharge. And Medicare will only really look at whether the discharge status code on the claim does not indicate a transfer. Then they're going to come back and reject your claim. So it really lets Medicare know what is intended for that patient post-discharge.
Mary, what are the types of post-discharge care affected by the rule?
The post-acute care that is affected by the rule would include acute care, and that would be coded a discharge status code of an O2. Skilled nursing care, which would be coded a discharge status code of a O3. Home care, which is a discharge status code of O6. Hospice, as of 10/1/18, and that's either 50 or 51 for a code. Inpatient rehab, long-term acute, and then finally psychiatric care is also impacted by the rule, and that's a discharge status code of 65.
And who's responsible for getting the discharge status code correct?
You know, ultimately, Medicare is very clear that it's the provider who's responsible to get the discharge status code correct. You know, and again, Medicare has always been clear on that. And if it isn't correct, unfortunately, there's one of two things. Either your claim's going to reject, in the example of coding something, a discharge status code of an O1 indicating the patient went home, but in fact that patient ended up receiving home care. That claim would reject with a C7272 indicating an overlap. and you would have to correct that claim, indicate the 06, and receive the per diem potentially if it was below the geometric mean length of stay. Or potentially what's going to happen is if you coded it an 01, or I'm sorry, if you coded an 06 and the patient did not receive the home care, then you're going to receive the per diem inappropriately when the patient didn't receive home care. So it's really on the provider to get it correct. And again, if there is post-acute care providers and Medicare knows it, you will get a rejection. But they will never, ever, ever come back and tell you that, the patient did not receive that post-acute care. Here's your full DRG. But as it relates to with the responsibility within the hospital, it really should be a collaboration. The physician should get it right in the discharge summary on where that patient's going with a little bit of detail wrapped around it. Utilization management or case management should include in their notes the needs of the patient at the time of discharge and where that patient is heading to, whether it be home or home with services, or whatever the case may be, with enough documentation that at the point where HIM is involved and coding is involved, coding can get it right based on the information in the chart.
Got it. And Mary, at the top of the podcast, we talked about retrospective reviews for Transfer DRG, recovery, and ensuring accurate reimbursement and compliance, and the idea that not all reviews are created the same, essentially. In your opinion, what do many reviews lack?
The number one thing that many of the retro reviews lack is the clinical review piece, and then they purely rely on the common working file, and definitely that's the piece that is missing and puts the recommendation of a discharge status code at risk for being non-compliant.
So the common working file, something that every hospital and anyone who works with claims is used to working with. Why is that insufficient by itself to determine the level of post-acute care provided?
The common working file is insufficient for several reasons and leaves significant room for error. The lack of a claim in the common working file or the actual presence of a claim in the common working file really does not dictate the appropriate discharge status code that's on the claim. And I'll give some examples with that. So in the example of a discharge status code of an 03, there are many reviews that are done where they will rely on the utilization in the common working file to determine whether the patient receives skilled care or not. So when you look at the span of care, that includes the inpatient stay. If by chance they do not see a claim post the inpatient discharge, they might say, the patient did not receive skilled care. Let's code it an 04 or an 01 because the patient did not receive the skilled care. Unfortunately, most skilled nursing facilities do not submit a zero pay claim if the skilled care is not covered by Medicare. So if there isn't that qualifying stay, or if benefits exhaust and Medicare is not going to pay for the skilled care provided, then there would not be that presence there. And potentially the patient did receive skilled care. So again, in that scenario, you would never, ever, ever want to rely solely on the common working file. And in the example of a patient that has a discharge status code of an 06 indicated on their claim, and when you look at the common working file and you look in HIQA, you see that the patient did in fact receive home care and that they were in a home care span prior to being admitted to the hospital. But without a clinical review on that and reaching out to the post-acute care provider, you can't tell whether that care was related or not, or whether if it started with it at post 3 days of discharge, to determine whether you should appropriately append a condition code of 42 or 43 and receive that full DRG in that scenario. So again, whether there's a claim or utilization within the common working file, that does not dictate the discharge status code and should never dictate the discharge status code.
Mary, what would you say providers should be either be doing on their own or asking of their vendors when it comes to ensuring their Transfer DRG reviews are completed accurately and in a compliant manner?
Providers should, if they're using a vendor, providers should always ask their vendor if they have clinical resources that work on the reviews, and are they placing calls out to the post-acute care providers? They should ask, what are their steps they take to validate the appropriateness of a discharge status code? And if it's something that providers are doing internally, it should be the same. They should be utilizing clinical resources to review the case management notes, to review the physician notes, and all of this is to determine the needs of the patient post-discharge, and then, reaching out and speaking to that post-acute care provider to determine the type of care that patient received, and that's just not isolated to calling the skilled nursing facility, but you should call home health agencies. And if the patient is intending to be transferred to an acute care facility, speak to that post-acute care, acute care facility and determine, was the patient admitted or not? And if they were, did you bill Medicare? So on and so forth. Make sure you're asking the appropriate questions prior to recommending a discharge status change. And again, if you do not take those necessary steps from a clinical review perspective, your discharge status is at risk for being non-compliant.
Yeah, and no hospital wants to be there. As I mentioned again at the top of the podcast, Transfer DRG revenue recovery is something that we specialize in here at BESLER. And if you'd like to learn more about how we do it, you can go to BESLER.com and just click on the services tab at the top, and you'll see Transfer DRG revenue recovery there, and you can read all about it, look at some articles, check out a video that we have there, and understand more about what a complete and compliant process looks like. Mary, thanks again for shedding some light on this topic and helping us understand more about compliant Transfer DRG revenue recovery.
Great. Thanks for having me.
This concludes today's episode of the Hospital Finance Podcast. For show notes and additional resources to help you protect and enhance revenue at your hospital, visit BESLER.com/podcasts. The Hospital Finance Podcast is a production of BESLER. Smart about revenue, tenacious about results.